Look at her. Maggie, please, don't embarrass this family today. I'm not here to embarrass anyone.
Then prepare yourself, because everyone is about to see what you're really worth.
Maybe they are.
Maggie Whitfield stood perfectly still in the middle of the ballroom. And for the first time in her 52 years, every single eye in the room was fixed on her. Not with warmth, not with love, but with a kind of hunger that only comes right before someone gets humiliated in public. The chandeliers above her burned gold, throwing soft light across 200 faces, and every one of those faces wore the same expression, a smirk barely hidden behind a champagne glass, a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Somewhere behind her, she could still hear the echo of laughter that had rung out only minutes earlier, laughter aimed directly at the dress she was wearing, the same dress her family had called cheap, outdated, embarrassing. And now, standing at the front of that same room, an auctioneer named Desmond Hale raised his gavel high into the air, and the entire room went silent, waiting. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 minutes earlier, they were laughing at her dress. Whispers had traveled from table to table like a wildfire nobody bothered to put out. Cruel little comments disguised as jokes, the kind of laughter that cuts deeper than any shouted insult ever could. Maggie had heard every word. She had felt every glance. And yet she had not moved, had not flinched, had not given her family the satisfaction of watching her crumble in front of strangers. What none of them knew, not her sister, not her mother, not a single guest seated beneath those glittering chandeliers, was that they were about to be corrected. Not quietly, not privately, but in front of 200 witnesses, in the very room where they had tried to make her small. A truth was about to surface that would change the way every person in that room saw her, forever. The gavel came down, and the number Desmond Hale spoke into that microphone did something none of them expected. It did not simply surprise the room. It silenced it completely. Conversations that had been humming for hours died in an instant, mid-sentence, mid-laugh, mid-breath. Forks stopped halfway to open mouths. A waiter froze near the kitchen doors, tray balanced in his hands, unsure whether to move or stay perfectly still. Even the string quartet, tucked quietly in the corner of the ballroom, lowered their bows without being asked, sensing that something far bigger than music was happening in that moment. Maggie's face, caught somewhere between disbelief and something close to relief, would later be described by more than one guest as the exact second everything they thought they understood about her fell apart. But to understand this moment, the frozen silence, the gavel suspended in midair, the number that no one in that ballroom could quite believe, we have to go back. Not just to this morning, when Maggie stood alone in a hotel room slipping into a dress she had been told not to wear. Not just to last night, when her own sister pulled a stranger aside and whispered instructions meant to embarrass her in front of everyone she loved. We have to go back much further than that. 40 years further, in fact, to a small sewing room that no longer exists. A room that once smelled faintly of chalk dust and Chanel No. 5, where an old woman placed a folded garment into the hands of a young bride and told her something she would not fully understand for 4 decades. Dorothy Whitfield had never been a woman of many words, but on that particular afternoon, 40 years ago, she chose her words with the kind of care most people reserve for a eulogy or a wedding vow. She was 73 years old at the time, her hands slightly trembling from age, though her eyes remained as sharp and steady as they had been in her younger years working alongside some of the most celebrated designers in the country. She unfolded a garment bag on the small wooden table in her sewing room, revealing a dress unlike anything Maggie had ever seen, delicate stitching, fabric that seemed to catch light differently than anything sold in an ordinary store. Dorothy placed it gently into Maggie's hands and told her this was not simply a dress. It was a debt, she said, one that had been paid to her decades earlier, and now she was passing that debt forward. Maggie had been only 22 years old at the time, newly engaged to Thomas Whitfield, Dorothy's only son, and utterly unprepared for the weight of what she was being handed. She remembered asking Dorothy why she was giving something so clearly valuable to her, a young woman she had known for barely a year. Dorothy had only smiled, the kind of smile that held more history than explanation, and told her that some gifts are not meant to be understood right away. She instructed Maggie to wear it only once, and only for something that truly mattered, something worth marking for the rest of her life. Maggie had nodded, folded the dress carefully back into its bag, and placed it in the back of her closet, where it remained untouched for years, waiting patiently for a moment neither of them could yet predict. Thomas Whitfield passed away 3 years before the events in that ballroom, taken suddenly by a heart condition no one had seen coming, leaving Maggie a widow at the age of 49. In the years that followed his death, Maggie built a quiet life for herself, working as a school librarian in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio, mending clothes for neighbors in the evenings to bring in a little extra income, though she never once called it a business. Her home was modest but cared for, filled with photographs of Thomas and small reminders of the life they had built together. There was a chair in the corner of her living room that no one else ever sat in, not out of any rule she had spoken aloud, simply because some habits of grief become permanent fixtures of a home without anyone deciding it should be that way. It was on an ordinary Tuesday evening, while Maggie was grading a stack of returned library books at her kitchen table, that the wedding invitation arrived. Thick cream cardstock, gold lettering, the kind of invitation that announced money before a single word was read. Her niece, Bethany, was getting married, and the ceremony would be hosted by Bethany's mother, Maggie's older sister, Diane Caldwell, at a private estate just outside the city, the kind of venue typically reserved for corporate galas and political fundraisers. Tucked inside the envelope was a small handwritten note in her mother Vivian's unmistakable cursive, a single line that Maggie read twice before setting the invitation down. "Do try to make an effort this time, dear," it read, 5 words carrying 20 years of quiet family judgment behind them. Maggie sat with that note longer than she expected to. It was not the first time her family had made their opinion of her clear, not through shouting or open conflict, but through smaller, sharper moments, comments about her modest salary, gentle mockery disguised as concern, the persistent implication that she had somehow failed to keep pace with the rest of the family after Thomas died. Diane had married into wealth through her husband Roger Caldwell, a successful real estate developer, and their lifestyle had only grown more visible with each passing year, vacations documented in photographs, a home renovated twice in a decade, a level of comfort Maggie had never chased and never envied. Still, being reminded of the distance between their lives, especially now, stung in a way she hadn't expected it to. That night, unable to sleep, Maggie found herself standing in front of her closet, staring at the garment bag she had not opened in years. She pulled it down carefully, unzipped it, and looked at the dress Dorothy had given her 4 decades earlier, still perfectly preserved, still carrying that same faint, indescribable elegance that had struck her the very first time she saw it. She thought about Dorothy's words, "Wear it only once, for something that truly matters," and she thought about Bethany, the one member of that side of the family who had never once made her feel small, who still called her every few weeks just to talk, who had always looked at Maggie with something closer to admiration than pity. Perhaps, Maggie thought, this was finally the moment Dorothy had been describing all along. She decided, in the quiet of that late hour, standing barefoot on her bedroom floor with the dress held gently against her body, that she would wear it, not to prove anything to her sister, not to silence the voices that had spent years suggesting she had somehow diminished since Thomas's passing, but because something in her chest told her this was the moment Dorothy had been speaking of. She hung the dress on the outside of her closet door, where she would see it every morning leading up to the wedding, a quiet promise to herself that she intended to keep. She had no way of knowing, as she turned off her bedroom light that night, Just how much that single decision would come to matter, or how many people would spend the following weeks underestimating exactly what she had chosen to wear. The rehearsal dinner was held 2 nights before the wedding, at Roger Caldwell's private estate, a sprawling property with manicured gardens and a driveway lined with valet attendants directing a steady stream of luxury vehicles. Maggie arrived in a simple navy dress, tasteful and understated, saving Dorothy's gift for the following day as she had always intended. The moment she stepped through the door, she felt the familiar shift in the air that came with entering rooms like this one, the quiet, practiced glances that measured a person's worth before a single word was spoken. A string quartet played softly near the entrance. Servers moved silently between guests with trays of champagne. Diane greeted her with an air kiss that never quite landed, followed almost immediately by a comment about how nice it must be to get by comfortably on a librarian's modest salary. Maggie let the comment pass, as she had learned to do over the years, offering only a small, composed smile before moving further into the gathering to find Bethany. It was while searching for her niece that she found herself walking past a narrow hallway near the kitchen, close enough to overhear a conversation she was never meant to hear. Diane's voice, low but unmistakable, drifted from just around the corner, speaking to Roger about tomorrow's ceremony. "She's going to embarrass Bethany," Diane said. "She always does. I want tomorrow to be perfect. For once, let's not let Maggie's situation cast a shadow over everything." Maggie stood frozen for a moment, one hand resting lightly against the wall, absorbing words that confirmed something she had long suspected but had never actually heard spoken aloud with such certainty. What followed, however, caught her far more off guard than Diane's cruelty ever could. Roger's response was not dismissive agreement, nor was it defense of his wife's harsh assessment. Instead, his voice carried a strange, careful edge to it, one that didn't quite match the conversation happening around it. "Just leave her alone about the dress thing tomorrow," he said quietly. "Trust me." Maggie did not understand what he meant by it, could not place why a comment about her dress, a garment neither of them had even seen yet, would prompt such an oddly protective tone from a man who rarely spoke to her directly at all. She filed the strange remark away in the back of her mind, uncertain what to make of it, and continued down the hallway before either of them realized she had heard anything at all. Later that same evening, Vivian found her standing near the garden doors, a glass of untouched wine in her hand, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the tree line. Her mother's approach carried the same practiced gentleness it always did when she intended to deliver criticism disguised as concern. She suggested, almost offhandedly, that Maggie might consider borrowing something from Diane's closet for tomorrow's ceremony, something a little more appropriate for the occasion, she said, given how important the day was for Bethany. Maggie felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever her mother spoke to her this way. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not simply nod and absorb it. She declined politely, her voice steady, and told her mother she already had exactly what she intended to wear. Morning arrived with a pale golden light spilling through the curtains of Maggie's hotel room, and she woke earlier than she needed to, unable to settle her nerves back into sleep. She showered slowly, deliberately, allowing herself time she rarely gave to occasions like this. When it finally came time to dress, she unzipped the garment bag she had carried carefully from home, laid it across the bed, and stood looking at it for a long moment before stepping into it for the first time in 40 years. The fabric moved differently than anything she owned, settling against her with a weight and grace that felt almost unfamiliar. She looked at herself in the mirror, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, found herself speaking softly to a photograph of Thomas resting on the nightstand, telling him she wished he could be the one walking her into that ballroom. The estate where the ceremony was held had been transformed overnight into something resembling a magazine spread, white orchids lining every aisle, tables draped in ivory linen, a ballroom prepared for the reception glittering beneath chandeliers imported specifically for the occasion. Guests arrived dressed in the kind of modern designer wear that announced its price tag from across the room, sleek silhouettes and sharp tailoring that photographed beautifully under bright light. Maggie's dress, by comparison, read to untrained eyes as something older, softer, slightly out of step with the current moment, its silhouette belonging to a different era entirely. She noticed the glances almost immediately upon entering, quick, assessing looks followed by expressions that shifted just slightly, the kind of reaction people try and fail to hide. It didn't take long for the whispers to begin. A cousin she barely recognized leaned toward another guest near the bar, laughing behind a raised hand, asking loud enough for Maggie to hear whether she had raided a costume shop before arriving. Diane, standing only a few feet away, did nothing to correct the comment, offering instead a soft laugh of her own before adding that this was simply how Maggie was. She'd never cared much about how she looked. The words landed exactly as they were intended to, and Maggie felt heat rise briefly to her face before she forced her expression back into something calm and unreadable. It was Bethany, appearing at her side moments later in her wedding gown, who offered the only genuine warmth Maggie had received all morning, wrapping her in a tight hug and telling her, with complete sincerity, that she looked beautiful. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows and quiet tears, and by the time the reception began, the ballroom had filled with the low hum of conversation, clinking glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter from tables scattered across the room. Partway through the evening, Vivian rose and took the microphone near the head table, announcing to the room that in addition to celebrating Bethany and her new husband, tonight's reception would also include a live charity auction, with all proceeds benefiting the Children's Hospital where Vivian had served on the board for over a decade. She introduced the evening's auctioneer, a well-known professional named Desmond Hale, and mentioned briefly that several distinguished guests in attendance tonight included appraisers and philanthropists familiar with fine art and rare collectibles, though none of the names meant anything to Maggie at the time. What Maggie did not see, seated near the back corner of the ballroom, was Diane pulling Desmond Hale aside near the entrance to the kitchen only minutes before the auction was scheduled to begin. Diane's tone was light, almost playful, as she suggested adding what she called a little joke item to tonight's lineup, something fun for the guests, she explained, gesturing subtly toward where Maggie sat. "My sister's dress," she said with a small laugh, "just for laughs, nothing serious." Desmond hesitated for a moment, something in his professional instincts registering mild discomfort at the request, but he agreed reluctantly, unaware of exactly what he was about to set into motion, or how dramatically the next 20 minutes would reshape everything everyone in that ballroom believed they understood about the woman sitting quietly near the back of the room. Backstage, in a small side room typically reserved for the bridal party, Desmond Hale found Maggie only minutes before the auction was set to begin, approaching her with the careful hesitation of a man who knew he was about to deliver news he didn't fully agree with. He explained, as gently as the situation allowed, that there was a small item planned for tonight's auction involving her dress, something intended as light-hearted fun for the guests. He told her plainly that she was under no obligation to participate, that she could simply step outside the ballroom for a few minutes and avoid the entire moment altogether, and no one would think less of her for it. Maggie listened quietly, absorbing the offer, understanding immediately that this had never been about charity or fun at all, but about something far more deliberate aimed directly at her. She stood there for a long moment, considering the choice in front of her. She could walk away, protect herself from whatever humiliation had been planned, and spare herself the discomfort of standing in front of 200 strangers while her own dress was mocked for entertainment. Or she could stay, knowing full well what likely awaited her, because leaving would mean missing the rest of Bethany's wedding entirely, and it would mean confirming, once and for all, to herself as much as to her family, that they had finally succeeded in making her small. As she considered her answer, her fingers moved instinctively to the collar of the dress, tracing along a small ridge of stitching hidden just beneath the fabric, something she had noticed years ago but never thought to question. She turned to Desmond and told him, in a voice steadier than she expected it to be, to proceed with the auction exactly as planned. She was not, she said, afraid of what people thought of a dress. Desmond studied her for a moment, clearly surprised by her composure, then nodded and returned to the ballroom to prepare, leaving Maggie alone with several minutes to gather herself before walking back out to face whatever was coming. Across the room, seated near the edge of the gathering, sat a woman named Eleanor Voss, a textile curator affiliated with a well-regarded museum collection, invited to the wedding as a longtime associate of Vivian's charity board. Eleanor had spent the earlier part of the evening only half listening to the preview list for tonight's auction items, more interested in her wine than in spa weekends and framed artwork, until something across the room caught her attention entirely by accident. She watched as Maggie adjusted the cuff of her dress near the edge of the stage, and something in the movement, the particular fall of the fabric, the almost imperceptible detail of the stitching along the seam, made Eleanor go suddenly, completely still, her wine glass paused halfway to her lips. She had seen that exact stitch pattern only once before, years earlier, cataloging an archive of mid-century couture pieces for a private collection, a technique so distinctive and so rarely used that she could count on one hand the number of garments she had ever encountered bearing it. She said nothing yet, unwilling to interrupt an event with nothing more than a hunch, but she found herself rising slowly from her seat, moving with quiet purpose toward the front of the ballroom, as Desmond Hale stepped back up to the microphone to begin the evening's live auction. The auction opened with a series of ordinary items designed to build energy in the room, a weekend spa package drawing playful competitive bidding between two tables of guests, a curated wine collection selling for several $1,000s amid scattered applause, a small original painting donated by a local gallery owner going for considerably more than its estimated value. The room buzzed with the particular electricity that live auctions create, guests leaning toward one another, raising paddles with theatrical flair, laughter rippling through the crowd with each winning bid. Maggie sat quietly near the back through all of it, watching the ordinary rhythm of the evening continue around her, aware that everything happening now was simply the calm laid carefully before whatever had been planned specifically for her. After nearly 40 minutes of steady bidding, Desmond Hale paused at the podium, glanced briefly toward Diane's table, and cleared his throat before announcing what he called a surprise final item for the evening. He gestured toward Maggie, standing near the edge of the stage where she had been quietly directed only moments earlier, the dress catching the chandelier light as she stood perfectly still. A ripple of laughter moved through Diane's table almost immediately, and Desmond, clearly uncomfortable with the framing he had been asked to use, attempted a joke of his own to soften the moment, asking who might like to start the bidding at $20. Nervous laughter spread further through the room, guests unsure whether to participate or simply wait for the strange moment to pass. It was at that exact instant that Eleanor Voss reached the front of the ballroom, raising her hand not to bid, but to speak. She asked Desmond, calmly and professionally, whether she might examine the garment before any bidding continued, framing her request as simple curiosity rather than urgency. Desmond, sensing something shifting in the room he didn't yet understand, agreed and stepped aside. Eleanor approached the stage, and with the practiced care of someone who had handled priceless textiles for decades, gently lifted the interior collar of the dress to examine the seam more closely. The room, still buzzing faintly with leftover laughter, slowly began to quiet as they watched her expression change from professional curiosity to something far more serious. She turned to face the room, and her voice, though not raised, carried a weight that silenced every remaining conversation instantly. "I need everyone to understand what they're looking at before this goes any further," she said. She explained, in careful, measured detail, "The hand-finished seems unlike anything produced by modern manufacturing. The nearly invisible stitching only a handful of couture houses in history had ever mastered." She folded back a small section of the interior collar, revealing a woven label so subtle it had gone unnoticed for 4 decades, and spoke a name that meant nothing to most of the guests, but clearly meant everything to a small handful of people in that room familiar with fashion history: Adeline Corbin. Eleanor explained that only 3 garments bearing that particular label were known to exist anywhere in the world, one housed permanently in a museum collection, one believed to belong to a private estate, and the third long presumed lost entirely. She looked directly at Desmond, and told him plainly that what he was holding in front of 200 people was very likely that third and final dress. Desmond, visibly recalculating everything he had said only moments earlier, stammered slightly as he addressed the room, admitting he had colleagues who specialized in exactly this kind of appraisal, and that if Eleanor's assessment was correct, they were no longer discussing $20, they were potentially discussing a figure well into 6 figures. The silence that followed was unlike anything that had filled that ballroom all evening, heavier than the earlier hush before the ceremony, entirely different from the polite quiet of dinner conversation. Slowly, that silence broke into a rising murmur of disbelief spreading table by table across the room. Diane's face had gone visibly pale, her earlier confidence evaporating in real time in front of the very guests she had hoped to impress. Vivian, seated near the front, sat frozen with an expression none of her children had ever witnessed on her before, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of 200 watching eyes now turned entirely away from Maggie and toward her own family instead. In the middle of the growing chaos, Roger Caldwell rose abruptly from his seat, his face pale in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with dread, pulling Diane firmly aside toward the edge of the room. What neither Diane nor anyone else in that ballroom yet understood was that Roger's reaction carried a weight far heavier than simple shock, a secret he had been carrying quietly for years, one that was about to unravel in front of everyone the moment Diane demanded to know exactly why he looked as though he had seen a ghost. Roger's hands trembled slightly as he guided Diane toward the far corner of the ballroom, away from the cluster of guests still murmuring over what Eleanor Voss had just revealed. Diane demanded to know what was wrong, her voice sharp with confusion layered over the earlier humiliation she was still struggling to process. Roger hesitated, glancing back toward the stage where Maggie still stood in stunned silence, before finally admitting something he had never planned to say out loud to anyone. Years earlier, not long after Thomas passed away, Roger had overheard his own mother-in-law, Dorothy, mention the name Adeline Corbin in passing during a conversation he barely paid attention to at the time, a name he later looked into out of nothing more than idle curiosity while researching estate valuations for one of his development projects. What he found during that research had unsettled him enough to remember it years later, details about a small number of surviving garments, rumors within collector circles of a piece believed lost since the 1960s, and a value that even then had been climbing steadily into astonishing territory. Roger admitted, quietly and with visible shame, that he had approached Maggie directly during that period, framing it as a sentimental gesture, offering to purchase the dress from her as a keepsake he claimed would honor Thomas's memory, all while deliberately withholding what he suspected it might actually be worth. Maggie had declined his offer at the time, not out of suspicion or shrewd calculation, but simply because she wasn't ready to part with something that had belonged to Dorothy, a decision made purely from grief and sentiment that had unknowingly protected her from being quietly taken advantage of by her own family. Diane stared at her husband, the pieces of tonight's earlier hallway conversations suddenly rearranging themselves in her mind. His strange insistence the night before, telling her to leave Maggie alone about the dress, had never been an act of protection toward Maggie at all. It had been self-preservation, a desperate attempt to prevent his years-old scheme from ever coming to light, terrified that tonight's cruel little joke might accidentally expose a secret he had buried for years. Diane's fury shifted directions entirely in that moment, no longer aimed solely at the disaster unfolding in front of 200 guests, but now turned squarely toward the man standing beside her, who had known the truth about that dress the entire time and said nothing. Back near the stage, Maggie remained standing exactly where she had been placed only minutes earlier, absorbing everything happening around her with a strange, quiet stillness. The mockery, the sudden reversal, the murmurs of her family's names spreading through the crowd, none of it fully registered as real yet. She thought instead of Dorothy, of that afternoon 40 years ago in a small sewing room that smelled faintly of chalk dust and Chanel No. 5, of the words spoken to her as a young bride who had no way of understanding their full weight at the time. Where it only once, Dorothy had told her, for something that truly matters, and you'll know when. Standing there now, in a ballroom full of people who had spent the evening trying to diminish her, Maggie finally understood exactly what her mother-in-law had meant all those years ago. This had never simply been about a wedding, or a dress, or even the staggering number Eleanor Voss had just spoken aloud in front of everyone. It was about a moment Maggie would need decades later, a moment when the people who claimed to love her most would try to make her feel small in public, and she would need proof, not for them, but for herself, that their opinion of her worth had never once been the accurate measure of it. As Desmond Hale returned to the podium, attempting to regain control of an auction that had transformed entirely from a light-hearted joke into the most significant item of the evening, Maggie took a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to face what would come next, not as the woman her family had mocked hours earlier, but as someone about to be seen, finally and completely, for the first time in years. Desmond Hale took several minutes to restore order to the room, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a man accustomed to high-stakes moments, though even he seemed visibly shaken by how quickly the evening had transformed. He explained to the room that given the significance of what Eleanor Voss had identified, proper appraisal procedures would need to take place before any formal bidding could responsibly continue, and that tonight's earlier framing of the item had been, in his words, entirely inappropriate given what they now understood it to be. He turned briefly toward Maggie, offering something close to an apology, acknowledging that she had never asked to be placed in that position, and that the decision to do so had not come from her at all. The room, still absorbing the weight of everything that had unfolded, listened in near total silence as he spoke. It wasn't long before Diane and Vivian approached Maggie privately, pulling her aside near a quiet corridor just off the main ballroom, away from the lingering eyes of guests still whispering over what they had witnessed. Maggie expected, perhaps naively, that this conversation might finally bring the apology she had waited years to hear. Instead, Diane's tone carried something closer to negotiation than remorse, suggesting almost immediately that since the dress had originally come from their side of the family, through Thomas and Dorothy, it might only be fair to split whatever value the eventual sale produced. Vivian nodded along beside her, framing the suggestion as practical rather than greedy, as though the events of the last hour had never actually happened at all. Maggie listened to both of them in silence, feeling something inside her settle rather than shatter, a steadiness she hadn't expected to find so easily in that moment. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, but carried a firmness neither Diane nor Vivian had heard from her before. She reminded them plainly that only an hour earlier, neither of them had wanted anything to do with that dress, except as a source of entertainment at her expense. She told them she would not be discussing dividing anything, because nothing about tonight had changed what the dress meant to her, only what other people now understood it to be worth. Diane opened her mouth to respond, but found, for perhaps the first time in her life, that she had nothing left to say to her sister. In the days that followed, Maggie made a decision that surprised even Eleanor Voss, who had reached out gently offering guidance on proper appraisal and potential sale through reputable channels. Rather than selling the dress, Maggie chose instead to have it formally appraised for insurance and historical purposes, then announced she would be donating an amount equal to its appraised value directly to the Children's Hospital Fund Vivian had spent years supporting, dedicating the gift publicly in Thomas's memory. It was not the outcome anyone in her family had expected, certainly not the quiet victory Diane had hoped to negotiate her way into, and it left even Vivian, for once, without a critical word to offer in response. Eleanor Voss, deeply moved by both the discovery and Maggie's response to it, offered to help arrange proper preservation of the gown, along with the possibility of a small museum exhibit dedicated to telling its full history, including the story of Dorothy Whitfield, whose own contributions to Adeline Corbin's work had gone almost entirely unrecognized during her lifetime. For Maggie, this mattered more than any dollar figure ever could, the chance to finally give Dorothy the recognition she had quietly deserved for decades, credit she had never once sought for herself while she was alive. Meanwhile, the fallout within Diane's marriage continued privately, away from public view. Roger's years-old secret, once fully exposed to Vivian as well, created a rift within the family that no amount of money or status could easily repair, leaving Diane isolated in a way she had never anticipated, caught between a husband who had deceived her and a sister she had spent years underestimating. It was, in its own quiet way, a consequence that extended far beyond the walls of that ballroom, reaching into corners of the family no one had expected the truth to touch. Amid all of this, it was Bethany who offered the one gesture that felt entirely free of complication or self-interest. Later that same evening, still in her wedding gown, she found Maggie standing near the edge of the dance floor and simply asked her to dance, the same way she might have asked years earlier, before any of tonight's revelations had taken place. For a few quiet minutes, surrounded by the same guests who had spent the evening whispering about her, Maggie allowed herself to simply exist in the moment, not as a woman who had been humiliated, and not as a woman suddenly revealed to be extraordinary, but simply as an aunt, dancing with a niece who had never once needed a number to know exactly what she was worth. Several months later, on a quiet spring afternoon, a small museum exhibit opened its doors under the title Dorothy Whitfield and Adeline Corbin, the gown's history forgot. Maggie stood before the display case holding the dress, now carefully preserved, a plaque beside it finally crediting both women by name for their contributions decades earlier. Diane arrived alone that afternoon, without Vivian, without Roger, standing quietly a few feet away for several minutes before finally approaching her sister. She admitted, simply and without excuse, that she should have seen Maggie clearly long before a stranger in a ballroom had to point it out to an entire room of witnesses. Maggie did not offer immediate forgiveness, nor did she pretend the years of quiet cruelty had never happened. She only nodded and told her sister honestly that they could work on it, together, starting now. Maggie thought often, in the months that followed, about that afternoon 40 years earlier, in a small sewing room that smelled faintly of chalk dust and Chanel No. 5, and the words an old woman had once spoken to a young bride who could not yet understand their meaning. Some inheritances arrive stitched carefully into silk, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Others arrive as something far less visible, the simple, hard-won ability to stand perfectly still while people underestimate you, and trust that time itself will eventually offer the correction you never had to ask for. Maggie never needed an auctioneer's number to know her own worth. She had known it long before that gavel ever fell. She had simply been waiting, patiently, for the rest of the world to finally catch up.